This week's Parshat is actually two Parshot, Tzaria and Metzora. And the reason why there's two is because in leap year, these are separated into two different ones. And that's also the reason why they have two Haftorah readings. So Tzaria means conceive and Metzora means leper. Oh, geez. So this is the housekeeping slide. I think Gabe quickly mentioned it, but I changed the picture this week because the house we're talking about is the temple. And the topic of the Parsha is how can we become pure to go back into the temple after we have been made impure or unclean? How can we become clean again? All right. So a little bit of vocabulary. The tzarat, that is a leprosy. It in the Bible, which can be on skin or garments or property. Metzora is the leper person. Tzarat is seed, and Tzaria means to conceive, to be fruitful, to scatter, to inseminate, all those different meanings. Tameh means unclean, and it can be unclean physically, but also religiously and ceremonially. And tahor is to be clean, to be pure, and that can be also physically of disease or ceremonially or morally. So a little summary of the Parsha is that basically it talks about the laws of purification. How do you get from unclean to clean, and why do you do it? And it talks mostly about leprosy, but it also discusses childbirth and various kinds of bodily secretions. So it seems that there's something about these conditions that render a person ritually unclean. It prohibits them from entering the temple and coming close to God. The purification rituals are needed to become ritually clean. Offerings after purification represent readmission to the temple, and the purification laws disappeared or were modified after the destruction of the temple. So there are two views of these impurity laws. One of them is that they're talking about physical infectious diseases, and that would suggest that the impurity is due to infection and the treatment is separation, and then there's a disinfection process in the ritual. But in the Levitical religious sense, it suggests that disease is a physical manifestation of a spiritual problem. And purification takes away the contamination and allows one to re-enter the presence of God and bring offerings into the temple. The purification rituals do not forgive sin. They provide atonement or covering for contamination. So just a little bit about why tzarat is called leprosy. So the current name for leprosy, well, one of the names for leprosy is Hansen's disease, named after the person who first described it. And that refers to leprosy as we know it today. We've all heard of people in various countries, India, Africa, and I'm sure there are some cases in North America of this particular disease. But it's thought that that disease actually didn't exist in the Near East at the time of Moses. One theory is that it was brought there from India by Alexander the Great and his army in the mid-300s BC. So that would have been, I mean, Moses' time was, let's say, 1500 BC. It was hundreds of years later. And Hippocrates, who lived around 500 BC, used the word lepra to describe a group of skin diseases that didn't include Hansen's disease. Well, the Greek translation of the Tanakh, the Septuagint, which was done somewhere in 200 to 300 BCE, uses the word lepra to translate the word tzarat. John of Damascus, an Arab Eastern Orthodox monk living near Jerusalem in 600 CE, so this is like 2,000 years after Moses, mistranslated lepra in the Septuagint as leprosy, and it now appears in almost all of our English translations. So the first thing to know is that the word leprosy in our English Bibles is not leprosy as we know it, and it's basically a long trail of mistranslation that got us there. So in Leviticus, when you read it, what is this leprosy or tzarat connected to? Well, one is sin, specifically lashon hora, which means speaking ill of somebody, evil speech. And it's also connected to death. And both of these ideas are based on the story of Miriam, which is in Numbers 12, verses 10 to 13, where it says, as the cloud, so Miriam had been speaking evil of Moses and Aaron, and the cloud withdrew from the tent. There was Miriam stricken with snow white scales. And when Aaron turned toward Miriam, he saw that she was stricken with scales. So basically, it's the same word, tzarat, that's in this story. And Aaron and Moses said, do not account to us the sin which we committed in our folly. Let her not be like a stillbirth dead fetus, my bracket, which emerges from its mother's womb with its flesh half eaten away. So Moses cried out to God, saying, God, pray, heal her. So when Miriam spoke evil against Moses and Aaron, she was afflicted with leprosy. And in this passage, that's connected her sin of evil speech with the disease of leprosy, and also with the concept of death, which Moses is praying for healing for. So the second thing is, another reason why we think of this as a spiritual disease is that the role of the priest in these chapters is not a medical doctor. He diagnoses and isolates people, but he doesn't cure them, the people afflicted by tzarat. And that suggests it's a physical manifestation of a spiritual problem that results from sin and leads to death. Another interesting point is not all things that make a person unclean are due to sin. I know whenever I read this passage, I go, wait a sec, why is that person bringing a sin offering? What did they do wrong? And one of those is a woman who gives birth. This is something that God commands us to do, to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. But I think when you look closely at each of the cases that are mentioned, there is a possibility to connect a common idea of contamination from and connected to disease, decay, and death. In that world, having a baby was a risk of death, both for the mother and for the child. The role of the priest was to declare things to be ritually clean or unclean. Does not mean that they remove sin. Instead, it means to be ritually pure in order to enter the presence of God. This tzarat is both a danger to the affected individual and can be contagious, and it can affect people, houses, fabric, leather, and stones. So it's not just about people, and it's not forgiving sin. It's bringing them back into the presence of God. And there's the verse about Miriam. So I tried to come up with a diagram that helps me understand what this is all about. And I'm fully aware that there are many different ideas of what these things mean. Some of them quite narrow, referring to the land of Israel and a particular disease and a particular sin. But when you read the whole passage, there seems to be other things that can render you unclean that need to be dealt with by this ritual. So if we start in the middle with the purification rituals, just talking about atonement, this word is repeated 11 times in those 3 to 4 chapters. One example is the one here in Leviticus 12:8. You may bring one animal as a burnt offering and the other as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for her and she will be clean. So this is a woman who's given birth to a child. And that phrase, this little wording, is repeated 11 times in those few chapters. So there is something that the Bible's trying to tell us about the ritual and atonement. Rituals, I mentioned, they apply not just to people, but to objects as well. And that when you read through them, you realize that there's other rituals in the book of Leviticus which are very similar. One of them is the one for Yom Kippur in Leviticus 16, where they have 2 goats. And one goat is sacrificed and one carries the sin of the nation to a faraway place in the wilderness. And they have the same kind of elements: cedar wood, scarlet yarn, hyssop, and living water in most of them. And also the ritual of the contamination by a corpse, which is like the highest contact with death, and the use of the red heifer, which we now know is beginning to be reestablished in Israel. So if you think of the Garden of Eden as the place where God's presence is fully felt, where God lived among us, among Adam and Eve, within us in the garden, and the loss of that connection with God's presence, with the flaming swords and the distance created between us and God because of what we chose to do, it leads to the exile from Eden. And you know, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, when you think of the word knowledge in Hebrew, it doesn't mean like knowing something in your head. It means it's the same word that's used for having sex with somebody. So it's intimate, experiential knowledge of both good and evil. And that's what we chose. We chose rather to be in a place where we would be able to experience both good and evil intimately, rather than to be in the place where God's presence was fully felt. And it resulted in our inevitable journey from birth to death. All of us are on that road, whether we like it or not. There are people who make a connection between the curse of Eve and her sorrow and conception and the loss of the presence of God in Eden. And that's part of the reason why she has to bring sacrifices in the world. So you end up out here contaminated by sin, these intimate experiential knowledge of good and evil, things we choose to do and things others do to us that take us away from God, and death, which is including life experiences that can bring disease, decay, and death. So when you look through the list in Leviticus, it seems like there are things like discharge from your body or having a baby that aren't really sin, but they are things that seem to connect us with our inevitable end in death. And so the place of the purification rituals is that we can go from this place where we are contaminated by all of these things back to where the presence of God is fully felt. And how do we do that? It's by going through this ritual of atonement. And that brings us close so that we can bring our korban, our offering, to God and become close to God again within the temple. There's also people who make a connection in this same way between the exile from Eden and Mount Sinai, but it doesn't really talk about that in this Parsha, and there wasn't room to go on about everything, but it seems to be that it's a almost like an archetype of our relationship with God and our loss of relationship with God and the path to get back to our relationship to God. So a couple of interesting ideas that I had, and I know that most Jewish people see the sin of Lashon Hora as the main reason why somebody would get tzarat, but it raises the question for me of whether or not all diseases have a physiological, psychosocial, and spiritual component. And in the last 300 years, there was an idea of dualism, which connected these three things, disconnected those three things, and treated them as having separate functions. But in the past few decades, there's not only been a widespread interest, but also a growing body of scientific research dedicated to exploring the interrelationship between the mind, the body, and the spirit, which I didn't put there, but the body meaning human physiology and medical illness. So, you know, I can think of situations where people get sick, but I mean, we see what's happening on the outside of them, but there's also healing that's needed on the inside of them. There's an example in the New Testament where the friends of a crippled man bring him to Jesus, and Jesus says, your sins are forgiven. And then he heals his physical disease. So Jesus could see that there was something deeper than the body that needed to be healed. And I think that in my view, that's also true of many of us, not meaning that we're caused to be sick because we're sinners, but rather that with every experience we have of some kind of loss of health, there is a component in that has to do with our spiritual life and something that God is trying to teach us through it. And then, like I said, a lot of people see this as really a specific illness for a specific sin. But I kind of also see that Moses was ahead of his time. The description of inflammation was first codified around the 1st century by a Roman scholar called Celsus. And he had these, well, it's either 4 or 5 things. He mainly had 4 things, but they were rubor, tumor, dolor, pallor, and functio laesae. That means redness, swelling, pain, fever or heat, and loss of function. And these things are still taught in first-year medical school as what you look for when you're looking for something that's inflamed. And in the Leviticus, it's talking about some of these elements. It talks about looking for swelling and redness and color and spreading of whatever it is on the person's body or the house. And then the second one is the germ theory of disease. So what does Moses do? He isolates people who have these things. And he recognized that somehow the affected person could contaminate others and was to be isolated until the illness was resolving. And this could apply both to physical illness, but also to spiritual illness. If you are spreading bad thoughts about or bad words about other people, then you need to be isolated as well until you're prepared to recognize that you shouldn't do that and come back with a attitude of repentance. But this idea of contamination of fomites and people spreading to other people was about 5,000 years before its time, maybe 4,000.
Wow.
Because these people, Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, they're just 2 examples in the history of medicine who lived in the 1800s. And Koch recognized that a bacteria caused the disease of anthrax and developed principles by which you could prove a specific microbe causes specific disease. And then Louis Pasteur, of course, also recognized that this was microbes that was causing disease and started the pasteurization of milk. And he suggested that these things could cause infectious disease and could be spread by people. And we also now know they can be spread by what we call fomites. So you all remember at the beginning of COVID that we were all washing our vegetables and not touching anything because we were thinking we were going to catch this germ from touching where somebody else touched. Well, in some cases you can. Apparently in COVID, it wasn't that bad. But what did people think before the 1800s? They believed in something called the miasma theory of disease. And it was thought that the diseases were spread by bad smells. And the solution to the illness spread was to get rid of the noxious odors and the bad night air. And this picture is a lithograph of this cholera epidemic spreading by the black cloud that's around his head and everybody running away from that, not recognizing that it was actually a microbe that it was being spread by. So when I said this to my grandson, he said, yeah, the doctors in the Middle Ages used to put flowers in their masks because they thought if they smelled something good, they wouldn't get the bad smell and they wouldn't die. So here are the questions. Do you think there's a connection between random disease and normal life experiences like having a baby and sin in our world today? And what is the connection between purification rituals and atonement? Maybe talk about that a bit. How do the rituals of purification in Leviticus speak to the purification of Gentiles and Jews together in the final redemption? I mean, one point that was brought out was that it's not always sin that causes the disease. It's sometimes the disease that causes you to become more righteous, because you have to reevaluate who you are by the fact that you are set aside for a period of time, in the same way that the Metzora was set aside to contemplate about what might be happening to him. So that was one thing. We also talked about the idea of atonement being a ritual process by which, when people find themselves in dire straits for whatever reason, whether it's a sin or a situation, there's a pathway back. And the pathway involves having your time of thinking, but also having your time of healing, and then coming back into the community through the agency of the Kohanim, who would perform the ritual and bring you back. Moshe shared that there is actually a group in Israel now that does something similar in situations where the thing that's happened isn't necessarily something to be handled by the Israeli police, but it can be handled by the community in a similar process. What else? Let me think. Dean, what else? Maybe one more.
Well, so what you're saying is that we've identified that the priest has been pushed aside sometimes, and we've given it to the judge and the police, etc., to deal with it, and we haven't necessarily dealt with the trauma that a person sometimes is going through.
And just also the real connection there is between the mind, how you think about things, and physical illness, that they really are interconnected, and also your spiritual expression is interconnected with all of these things. And sometimes God is working on the other things with the illness.
And also, and I think that's really important, and you've made it clear in your presentation, we discussed it, is that so often we can connect illness with sickness of any sort. And sometimes it has to do with potentially maybe even bringing glory to God. And Moshe brought up his sister had passed away, God bless her memory, maybe 7-8 years ago, Moshe. And in the last 2 years of a sickness with cancer, she wrote a blog that's still bringing encouragement to other people. And he shared that right off the heels of, we quoted the Job, who said, God speaks to us sometimes one way or another. To some, he speaks in a night vision, or in a dream or a night vision, and to others, he speaks on a bed of suffering. And so I know from the New Testament too, the disciples of Jesus once turned and says, you know, why is this person sick? His sin or his parents' sin? You know, and it was a real important point that was made, was it was for neither, but for the glory of God. And I think that's hard for, especially I speak to us as Christians, is sometimes we go, oh, you know, I wonder if this person's sick because of this, this, and this, you know, and it removes the empathy, and it isolates us from even being there to help some, you know, some very special individuals. Anything else? Moshe, Margaret.
Good. Well, I think that can dovetail into what we were saying in what we shared in our room. So we had Dave, myself, Hadassah, Yair, Anthony, and Lisa.
Paul, Tiffany. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and Tiffany was with us as well for a little bit.
Tiffany was. She's gone, but she's now with us. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things, Dean, just interesting that you know, Dave, you can chime in here if you want. Just this, he brought up this issue of what he called, it's stuck in my head, this, you know, pathological use of this association of someone's sin or, mistakes they've made with disease, and that can actually be self-serving to the person who's doing the analysis. And in some kind of toxic religious contexts, like in ministry healing, in faith healing, sometimes that can be an out for the failure of the faith healer to bring healing. So it's your sin. It's obviously, it's not my problem. You came to me and I can't do anything. You know, I thought that's a good point. And yet at the same time, you know, we were also sharing, you know, some personal stories about how there, you know, have been physical ailments that were directly connected or indirectly connected to behavior, to things that not only necessarily we did, but that someone else we were close to did. You know, and so there was a very clear association between sickness and disease and behavior and actions that someone else took. So maybe it's one of these areas where we have to be like, we have to put on our adult pants and realize that the world is a little bit complicated, and sometimes you have to use wisdom to discern, you know, not just make blanket black and white rules about everything, or to use these ideas to club someone over the head, but rather to just discern what's happening, what's going on here. You know, let's actually discern reality, what's going on, and use the Bible as a guide to help us, you know, have eyesight to see and to discern these things. So now Yair also shared a very interesting thought towards the end about being, in his word, born again, which for some of us Christians,
that was interesting.
it's becoming in computer language we call it an overloaded term, meaning it can have different applications. But Yair, I don't know if you want to, we can probably wrap up on that thought, and if there's anyone else in the room who wanted to share.
That would be nice.
Well, I think that the amazing mechanism that has been created here in the Parshat by God, who wants to help us with the dissonance that exists in every single one of us. I mean, there's like the right, which is what we want to be, and the left where we are, and there's always some kind of a gap, and that's what keeps us moving. We have to constantly do better in closing the gap and raising the bar. So when there is this dissonance between what we theoretically know we should be doing and what we're actually doing, God helps us get the kind of guidance that we need. And for that, he creates a special group of Kohanim, or priests. So that's what they specialize in. They're like the shrinks of that time, but they're beyond shrinks. They also look at the spirit, not just at the physiological and psychological. And they actually, that's what they specialize in really helping people get closer to God and closer to their inner self. And how does he do it? He creates these blemishes that are also the signals to the Kohen on what kind of issue there is here and how he can help him deal with it. And he has to go to a Kohen, and then the Kohen also meets him twice a week through the process where he has to work everything out. He gets isolated so that he can really give it the attention that is necessary. And then when the Kohen sees that the blemish is gone, which means he's ready to go back, he's not allowed to go back to the home. He actually has to go, he goes back to the camp, but he has for a whole week. He cannot go back into his home. It's like, maybe he would be embarrassed and he would normally just go back into his cave and not come out again. No, the Torah actually tells them, you've got to be out of your cave. You have to reconnect with society. Maybe you're the one who spread all kinds of bad things, and you ruined the air, and you caused all kinds of issues within society. Now you have a chance to reconnect with this society, but you're reborn, because you're going to come back without any hair, because that's part of the ceremony when he finishes. And he's even anointed with oil. In many ways, you have to go back, and you have to actually help make the world better, mend the world, and help perhaps others who are dealing with the same kind of dissonance that you've dealt with. So there is an amazing process from beginning to end that God has created here to really help us close the gaps between where we are and where we should be, or where we even aspire to be. And perhaps this is why it also appears all of a sudden in between the story of the two sons of Aaron, and then only in 2 weeks we go back to, it says after what happens to the sons of Aaron, we have the atonement and the Day of Atonement. It's like as if there's an interlude here But in this interlude, God is basically saying, look, I don't know what you're going to say about the two sons of Aaron, but it all amounts to one thing. They wanted so much to see God. There's a description even of how they looked at God, even beyond what they should have. There was a gap between where they were and where they really wanted to be. And God says, when you deal with sanctity, when you deal with God's dwelling, you've got to work on closing that gap. If you're not working on closing that gap, you can get into trouble. So God provides these mechanisms to help all of us close that gap so that we can really become more and more connected with God, and we can elevate ourselves to where we have to be as a people that has to become a sanctified people.
Thank you, Yair.
Excellent.
Started was the connection between cancer and trauma. And the majority of people that were struggling with bitterness, they had gone through trauma, divorce, what Lisa was talking about. And you could hear it in their voice. I mean, they would spew horrible things. There wasn't forgiveness. So we actually started like a kind of a, what do you call those, like mini trials, right?
Tribunal?
Where we took the book of Mishlei, we took the book of Proverbs, and we began to give specific, like we had 2 test groups, right? And the ones that started with the Torah and Mishlei, they started to heal faster than the other group.
I am not surprised. It
was fascinating. Wow. One of the most fascinating studies we started to do. So this is this is such a deep topic in both the areas that you and Lisa were speaking about.
Well, I would just like to say, right, I bless my ex-husband. I forgive him. I can share that story now without malice, without, like, I want his life to be healthy. Unfortunately, his decisions cost his relationship with me, but I still want our daughters, to honor their dad, because he's their dad, and he's a human being who failed. But I didn't want to go down the road that you're talking about. Like, I do believe that bitterness, we hurt ourselves when we withhold forgiveness, and, we also hurt others. But it just shows the power of the Word of God from what you're sharing. And that the great physician, he's the antidote, right? He's the solution to every problem we bring to him. What an amazing, and you had data, like you could see it, right? You could chart it. That's so cool. Thank you for sharing.
The other part I want to add to this, I became excited about Israel only after Lisa introduced me to Shabbat dinner. I saw it in her home. We brought that to my parents who were in their 90s. And there was something that broke in that meal. I call it a spiritual break, because there was forgiveness and tears that happened for issues we couldn't resolve, that we never resolved. So God's plan is to, these things happen because of our choices, but God has a bigger plan for the resolution of that, and for health and for healing.
Also
because of our choices.
God wants reconciliation and redemption in every phase.
May I ask you, the author of that article you talked about, was that Zaire Anpin?
The book.
That you. I'll put it in the chat. Yeah, it's actually the Kofit's Time. You can look it up.
All right, thank you.
Kofit's Time, lesson a day.
Thank you.
Yeah, you have to write that out, because we definitely could not have figured that one out.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Let me just share one last cool thing on the Kofit's Time. So I'm sure probably in a church you have something similar, but in the synagogue, in the women's section, we have a lot of gossip. And depending on the synagogue you go to, a lot of women, a lot of gossip. So when I started going to it was Connie Tversky's synagogue, Michael Tversky's synagogue, but it was in Milwaukee. I started going and I noticed that all the women showed up and none of them were gossiping. They were involved in the prayers and in the service, and it was just amazing. So I said, what do you do that I don't experience in other places? She said, we pair up women and they have to talk to each other for 10 minutes every day on one of the lessons of the Chofetz Chaim. And she said, this is how we deal with gossip. And she said, it is transformed. Their shul, I think they were running close to 1,500 families. I mean, a huge. And she said, it transformed our shul. And so, these understanding how to put boundaries around this really can be a real blessing to our lives. Yeah.
Mhm.
That kind of thing, like I've never heard of a Christian church doing that. Like that's a beautiful. That's a beautiful.
Not a lot of synagogues do that either, but it's really was. It was
a beautiful
so
tool.
brilliant. It's
Well,
amazing.
Gossip sometimes is the fuel that runs some churches. So you got to think. I'm just joking.
Yeah.
It's sad, yeah.
But Paul, Tiffany, David, we'd like to hear your voices as well. Do you guys have any thoughts about what we've been talking about? No pressure. But
could you kindly flash the questions again? I missed them. I walked out, so I'm not sure of the actor phrase.
Okay, I'm going to read them, David. Listen in. Okay. The one we just talked about it in length is, do you think there is a connection between random diseases, normal life experiences, and sin in our world today? The next question is, what is the connection between purification rituals and atonement? And then the last question is, how do the rituals of purification in Leviticus speak to the purification of Gentiles and Jews together in the final redemption?
Okay, thank you. I think on question number one, because man is tripartite, body, soul, and spirit. The three are interconnected. So there will always be a manifestation of, if there is a problem in one area, it will manifest in the other two. So I think there is a definitive link. We just need to be discerning enough to be able to to understand and pick it up. I was quite intrigued by what you said, Hadassah, about the research you did in the oncology department. I would like to hear more about that, because my personal conviction is that everything begins in the spiritual and ends in the spiritual. So whatever manifests as disease, whatever manifests as problems of the human mind, all these things will find their resolution in the spiritual. And so I'm quite intrigued that there was a lot of response when you did the two tests. Is that what you call in science, I think, the controlled tests, with the people who...
Controlled tests, yes.
Yes, absolutely. I'm intrigued by that. And for me, it confirms my belief about interrelation between those three areas of tripartite. I'm quite intrigued by that.
Let me see if I can find those documentations. It goes back into the 90s. So I did write a book, but I never finished it. I wrote about 10 chapters on the halakha of cancer, which it's a Jewish term for law, really, the laws. And so let me see. I haven't pulled that out for a couple decades. So let me see if I can find that, David, and I'll make sure I get it over to you.
Very good. Thank you.
Can you read that second question again, Kim?
Sure. The second question is, what is the connection between purification rituals and atonement?
I'd like to perhaps add something that might address this question. I think one of the most fascinating things that I find in the rituals that appear in this week's Parshat is how they're designed to achieve something that is otherwise extremely difficult to achieve. Having recognized this in the spirit of what David said, that everything begins with the spirit and ends with the spirit. Well, if somebody's got, if somebody needs to give some very serious spiritual attention to something, whether it's something that he said or whether it's something that he's doing, how do you get that person to do that? And here, God seems to have created in the Parsha an amazing mechanism. First of all, he's got Kohanim, or priests, who this is what they specialize in. They're like the shrinks of their time, but they're beyond psychology. You know, they're also about the spirit, right? So it's their job to meet people and to help them get closer to God. And God directs these people via these blemishes that they find in their body to go to a Kohen. They have to go to a Kohen. And then when they go to the Kohen then tells them, okay, you have to isolate yourself and so forth. But it doesn't stop there. The Kohen has to see him twice a week. And he has to be with him until this person actually finally does reconcile the internal dissonance that he has within him, right? Because that's our greatest problem, that there's some kind of a spiritual dissonance going on inside that we have to reconcile. So he brings him spiritual guidance, but he actually causes the person to go seek that spiritual guidance because he's got this blemish. And then the Kohen actually takes him into this process, which helps him isolate himself. Now see what happens when he's finally done. He's not allowed to go back to his home. He's allowed to back into the camp, but he has to sit another 7 days outside of his home. Now, if this person had caused social damage because he said all kinds of things, or he's just a troublemaker that's really disrupting society, this person comes back, he's completely shaved from head to toe. Everybody sees that this is a reborn person. He's even covered with oil, which is some kind of form of anointment. So this person comes back into the camp, and now all the people who perhaps suffered from this person in the past can now treat him as a newly born person. And he can't go hide in his cave. He's got to stay outside of his house. And it gives him a whole week to reconcile socially with the people around him before he can go back into his
Wow.
cave. So there's a complete, very detailed process here that God has created in the Parsha for helping people deal with all of these different issues that you've been talking about so beautifully until
Wow.
Okay, so that's for a man, but what about for a woman?
now. Why is it any different, man or woman in this case?
A woman would be totally shaved?
No. I don't think so.
Okay, we can look deeper into this and check it out. But, if you're born again, you're born again.
Wow.
And I really think that this is a process that this is possibly something that we really have to experience in order to say, yes, we are really born again. It's not just something in the mind that says, okay, I'm a new person. But that's so easy for us to go ahead and say, I've done tshuva, I'm not going to do it again. Of course,
But you come out
that fast.
and
But here you get a physical manifestation, not only of the spiritual issue that you have to resolve, but you're also getting a physical manifestation of what it means to be reborn and perhaps even anointed, because you now have a job to do. You have learned through this experience what's wrong with what you're doing and how it can really cause terrible damage within society. And now you are in some ways the ordained person to help others deal with the same kind of illnesses.
Marvelous.
It's really, really amazing too. And I believe isn't also this one of the sins that requires the red heifer and in the mikvah?
It's very interesting.
That's coming.
There
I
is
thought
a-
for leprosy, the touching the dead, of course, being the main one. And then I don't know why I thought fretting leprosy was also one of.
I take it back. First of all, the person sees he actually has to rend his clothes because he's mourning over himself. And there is a matter of sensing. It is very close. You're 100% right that it's extremely close to the laws pertaining to a person who's come in touch with somebody who's actually dead. In this case, he has to become in touch with his own the deadness,
Like his own death, right?
But
wow.
So I have no doubt that there are aspects of purification and impurity that are very similar, but I know that there are also differences. And unfortunately, since we don't have this today, don't remember them offhand, but we should definitely look into it.
And for Lisa's question real quick, one interesting thing, you do see for women, all the laws pertaining to childbirth. However, usually, because the woman is swallowed in the man, she's one, biachad, so he takes care of that. Go ahead.
Forgive me, because if Lisa's question was regarding a woman who gives birth, it's a completely different story.
Yeah, I don't think it was. I just mentioned it.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we're not.
Yeah, no. Yeah. I just mentioned. I don't think she meant that. Did you mean that?
No, I didn't mean that. There was a time a few weeks ago, it must have been in February, when Paul said, I want to know about all of this because it helps me to know God better. I want to know what every one of these laws is about. And every time we're talking, I hear Paul's voice saying that. Paul, can you hear me? You gave me such a desire to search this out. And when you were just saying that, Yair, it makes me want to cry, because I feel like it sheds light on these aspects of our Father that I had no idea. I had no idea. Like, he takes care of every detail for us. It's not about being picky or legalistic. It's about covering every aspect of everything that we need to come into that restoration of wholeness.
Oh, sorry, Paul wants to say something. I don't want to
Paul, go ahead, and you guys, we're already like 12 minutes over, so I got to close the groups. So, like, it's already 12 after, so I got to close the group. So, Paul, go ahead and say something, and then I got to close this up. See, there's like a whole minute going on here.
Paul, did you want to say something? Because I could add just one more minute of expanding this framework, because notice that these portions are actually very much in between, like kind of in the midst of a story. We saw the two sons of Aaron dying, and then all of a sudden we go into this segue where we talk about the things that we talked about. And then afterwards, we'll see in another 2 weeks, we'll go back to the story of the two sons of Aaron with the atonement and the Day of Atonement and the description of how that is accomplished. So I'm just going to give food for thought. If we can understand that the problem that is posed by the two sons of Aaron is that there is a dissonance between where they want to be and where they actually are.